The equation of the California gold rush is mathematically impossible without a specific variable that most historians ignore. You're taught that men found gold, picked it up, and became rich. This is a fairy tale. Gold is not found in nuggets big enough to see. It is found in dust, microscopic flakes, and flour locked inside quartz. You can stare at a ton of high-grade ore and not see a single speck of yellow. To get it out, you cannot use your fingers. You need a chemical magnet. You need mercury, Quicksilver. Without mercury, the California gold rush yields about 10% of the wealth recorded in the history books. The other 90% washes down the river unrecovered. The reality of 1849 was not a hunt for gold. It was a hunt for the silver liquid that could catch the gold. The economics are stark. At the height of the boom, a flask of mercury, 76.5 pounds of liquid metal, could cost over $100. That is roughly $3,500 in today's currency. And unlike a shovel or a pickaxe, which you bought once, mercury was a consumable. You boiled it off, you spilled it, you washed it into the creek. The mines of California didn't just need a bottle of it. They needed 3,000 tons of it a year. The supply chain of this toxic metal was the single most strategic choke point in the 19th century economy. If you controlled the mercury, you controlled the gold. And for a terrifying window of time, the entire gold output of the United States was dependent on a single hole in the ground in Santa Clara County, the new Almaden mine. This mine didn't produce a gram of gold. It produced the quicksilver that made the gold standard possible. It generated more profit than any gold mine in history, and it did so by poisoning its workforce with a level of efficiency that makes modern industrial accidents look like rounding errors. Let us enter the physical reality of the new Almaden mine in 1855. It is located in the Capitan Silos Hills, south of San Jose. The geology is unique. The rock here is red. It is cinnabar, mercury sulfide. It looks like dried blood dried into the sandstone. The specific gravity of cinnabar is 8.1. It is incredibly heavy. When the miners strike the rock with steel drills, it doesn't spark. It crumbles into a heavy red dust that coats their skin, their lungs, and their food. The temperature inside the drift is nearly 100 degrees. The ventilation is poor. The men are mostly Mexican laborers. Tenateros, carrying 200-pound sacks of ore up notched log ladders called escaleras. They are paid a decent wage, about $3 a day or $100 adjusted. But they are selling their nervous systems by the hour. The processing of this ore is where the horror begins. To get the mercury out of the rock, you have to roast it. You build a fire under the red rocks. The heat breaks the bond between the sulfur and the mercury. The sulfur turns into sulfur dioxide, a choking gas that turns to acid in your lungs. The mercury turns into a vapor. It is invisible. It rises into the condenser chambers, brick tunnels where the air cools down. As it cools, the vapor condenses back into liquid metal, dripping down the walls like sweat, pooling in iron troughs. The job of the furnace men is to collect this liquid. They are breathing mercury vapor. They are walking on floors slick with mercury. The air in the hacienda, the processing plant, shimmers with it. A man working the condensers has a life expectancy measured in months, not years. The clinical term for what happens to them is hydrargyrism, but the miners called it the shakes. It starts with the gums. They turn blue. Then the teeth loosen. You can pull them out with your fingers. Then the salivation starts. A man in the advanced stages of mercury poisoning will produce liters of saliva a day. He cannot speak. He cannot swallow. He drools uncontrollably. Then the tremors hit. The dance to St. Guy, St. Vitus's dance. Your limbs jerk. You cannot hold a spoon. You cannot button your shirt. Finally, the psychosis sets in. The phrase Mad Hatter comes from the felt industry using mercury. But the miners at New Almaden were the true madmen. They would hallucinate, become aggressive, and eventually die in a state of delirium. But the market didn't care about the teeth of a few hundred laborers. The market needed the metal. To understand why, you have to look at the patio process and the stamp mills of the mother lode. When a gold miner in the Sierra Nevada crushed his quartz, he was left with a slurry of sand and gold dust. The gold particles are hydrophobic. They repel water. They are also heavy. But if the water is turbulent, the gold will float away. The recovery rate using just gravity, sluice boxes and pans, is roughly 60%. You're throwing away 40 cents of every dollar. Enter amalgamation. If you introduce mercury to that slurry, a chemical miracle happens. Mercury has a high surface tension and an atomic affinity for gold. It wets the gold, it swallows it. A drop of mercury will absorb gold dust until it becomes a stiff, buttery paste called amalgam. This amalgam is heavy and easy to catch in the riffles of a sluice box. The standard operating procedure in a stamp mill was to coat copper plates with mercury. As the crushed ore washed over the plates, the mercury grabbed the gold and held it. The sand washed away. At the end of the shift, the millman would scrape the gray paste off the plates. It looked like wet cement. It was actually 50% gold and 50% mercury. To separate them, they used a retort. This is a cast iron vessel, like a pressure cooker. You put the amalgam inside and heat it. The mercury boils at 674 degrees Fahrenheit. Gold melts at 1948 degrees. So, the mercury turns to gas, travels down a tube, cools, and turns back into liquid in a bucket of water. The gold is left behind in the retort as a spongy, yellow mass called sponge gold. The economics of this cycle were brutal. A mill losing mercury was losing money. The loss rate was a key metric. In the early days, for every pound of gold recovered, a pound of mercury was lost to the environment, washed down the river, or vented into the atmosphere. That is a 1-to-1 ratio of toxicity to wealth. This created a stranglehold on the industry. There were only two major sources of mercury in the world in 1850. One was the Almaden mine in Spain, controlled by the Rothschild banking family. The other was New Almaden in California. If you were a miner in the Sierras, you couldn't buy from Spain. The shipping costs and time were prohibitive. You had to buy from New Almaden. The owners of New Almaden knew this. They had a monopoly on the catalyst of the gold rush. They could set the price. In 1850, a flask cost nearly $120, $4,000 today. The production cost was roughly $18, $600 today. The profit margin was astronomical. The Baron, Forbes & Cohen Group, which operated the mine, was extracting wealth faster than the gold miners they supplied. This drew the attention of the federal government. The legal battle for New Almaden is one of the most complex land grant cases in American history. It wasn't about the land. It was about the strategic reserve of mercury. The United States government realized that without this mine, the gold supply would collapse. If the gold supply collapsed, the currency, which was backed by gold, would collapse. The case, the United States versus Castillero, went all the way to the Supreme Court. It involved forged documents, secret agents, and international diplomacy. At one point, President Abraham Lincoln, in the middle of the Civil War, nearly caused a rebellion in California by ordering the seizure of the mine. He sent a writ to the local marshal to take the mine by force. The mine operators armed themselves. They threatened to blow the tunnels. Lincoln, realizing he couldn't afford a second civil war in the West, backed down. But the message was clear. Mercury was a matter of national security. During the Civil War, the Union needed gold to buy munitions and pay soldiers. The Confederacy had cotton, but the Union had California gold. That gold was processed with New Almaden mercury. If the Confederates had managed to sabotage the mercury mine, the Union's credit rating would have evaporated. The gray flask was as important to the war effort as the cannonball. Let's zoom in on the specific mechanism of transport. Mercury is a liquid metal. You cannot ship it in wooden barrels. It will leak through the pores of the wood. You cannot ship it in glass. It is too heavy and will shatter the bottle. The industry standard was the iron flask, a wrought iron cylinder, about a foot high, with a screw top. It held 76.5 pounds of mercury. A mule could carry 2 flasks, one on each side. That's 150 pounds of dead weight. The mule trains leaving New Almaden were long, winding snakes of logic. If a mule stumbled and fell down a ravine, the flask would survive. But if the cap wasn't screwed on tight, using a wrench with a 3-foot cheater bar, the liquid would escape. There are accounts of flasks leaking in the holds of ships. The mercury would run into the bilge. It would amalgamate with the copper sheathing on the hull, literally eating the nails that held the ship together. A mercury leak on a ship was a structural emergency. The volume of material moved is staggering. Between 1846 and 1900, New Almaden produced over 1 million flasks. That is 76 million pounds of pure mercury. 38,000 tons. Almost all of it was dispersed into the environment. It wasn't consumed in the sense of being destroyed. It was spread out. The friction point in the system was the inefficiency of the early amalgamation methods. In the arrastras, crude grinding pits used by early Mexican miners, the loss rates were massive. An arrastra is a stone-lined pit where a mule drags a heavy stone in a circle to crush the ore. You throw mercury in the pit. It mixes with the mud. When you clean it out, you scrape the bottom, but the mercury seeps into the cracks of the stones. It seeps into the soil. Later, the hydraulic miners used undercurrents, massive sluice systems. They would dump hundreds of pounds of mercury into the riffles. When the winter floods came, the sluices would wash out. The mercury, being heavy, would sink into the riverbed. It is estimated that in the Yuba River alone, millions of pounds of mercury are still sitting in the sediment, waiting for a storm to move them. The human cost expanded beyond the mines. The mill workers who managed the copper plates also suffered. They didn't have the acute exposure of the furnace men, but they had chronic, low-level absorption. The trembles were a common occupational hazard for mill operators. A man would work for 5 years, make his pile, and then retire with a nervous tick and a metallic taste in his mouth that never went away. The medical understanding of the time was barbaric. Doctors prescribed potassium iodide to sweat out the poison. It didn't work. They recommended drinking milk. It didn't work. The only cure was to stop working, but the wages were too high. A furnace man could earn in a week what a farmhand earned in a month. They traded their future for the present. The escalation of the industry led to the opening of other mines: New Idria, the Reddington Mine, the Oat Hill Mine. But none could match the scale of New Almaden. The geology there was a freak of nature, a massive plug of high-grade ore that seemed inexhaustible. By the 1870s, the price of mercury began to stabilize as supply caught up with demand, but the dependency never waned. The Comstock lode in Nevada, the Silver Strike, required even more mercury. The Washoe process for silver extraction used salt, copper sulfate, and massive amounts of mercury. The pan amalgamation method required mixing the silver ore in heated iron pans with quicksilver for hours. The consumption rates skyrocketed again. The Comstock mines were essentially eating the mountains of the Coast Range. The climax of the story is the environmental legacy that remains invisible to the naked eye. Mercury does not degrade. It is an element. It persists forever. The bacteria in the water column convert inorganic mercury into methyl mercury. This is the organic form that enters the food chain. It binds to protein. A bug eats the bacteria. A minnow eats the bug. A base eats the minnow. A human eats the base. At each step, the concentration increases. This is bioaccumulation. The mercury mined in 1860 is still in the ecosystem of the San Francisco Bay today. The reason there are signs warning you not to eat the striped base is because of the decisions made by the Baron Forbes & Co. in 1850. The forensic accounting of the cleanup is a modern nightmare. The new Almaden site is now a Superfund site. The taxpayers are paying millions to cap the piles of calcines, the roasted ore tailings. These red hills of dust still bleed mercury when it rains. The cost of the cure has far exceeded the value of the disease, but go back to the moment of the transaction. A miner walks into a general store in 1852. He puts a pinch of gold dust on the scale to pay for a flask of mercury. The shopkeeper weighs the flask. The exchange is silent. The miner needs the flask to get more dust. The shopkeeper needs the dust to buy more flasks. It is a closed loop of toxicity. The specific dollar amounts of the era drive this home. In 1874, the total value of Quicksilver produced in California was roughly $3 million. The gold produced was roughly $17 million. The mercury industry was a fraction of the size, but it was the lever that moved the world. Without the $3 million in mercury, the $17 million in gold stays in the rock. The leverage ratio is infinite. There is a myth that the gold rush was a democratizing event, that anyone with a pan could get rich. The geology of mercury proves this false. The pan was a prospecting tool, not a production tool. To produce, you needed a sluice. To run a sluice, you needed mercury. To get mercury, you had to pay the monopoly. The wealth didn't flow to the man in the creek. It flowed to the man who owned the red rock in San Jose. The flask itself is an artifact of industrial durability. You can find them in antique shops today. They are heavy, rusted, often still containing a few beads of the liquid metal trapped in the threads of the cap. They are the spent shell casings of the economic war. When the hydraulic mining was banned in 1884 by the Sawyer decision, the first major environmental ruling in the U.S., it wasn't because of the mercury. It was because of the silt. The mud was burying the farms in the Central Valley. The mercury was a silent passenger in that mud. No one talked about the poison, only the debris. It took another 100 years for the toxicology to catch up with the litigation. The miners at New Almaden had their own culture, their own town on the hill. They had festivals, a church, a distinct society separated from the valley below. They were the Cinabrios. They lived in the shadow of the chimneys. The children played on the roasted ore piles. The mortality records of the company cemetery are a testament to the cost. Softening of the brain was a common cause of death listed. It was a euphemism for the end stages of neurotoxicity. In the final analysis, the California gold rush was actually a mercury rush. The gold was the product, but mercury was the fuel. You burned mercury to get gold. The ratio was fixed by the laws of chemistry. And just like modern fossil fuels, the burning of that fuel left a residue that we are still breathing, drinking, and paying for. The wealth of the American West was built on a foundation of red dust and silver liquid. The mansions on Nob Hill in San Francisco were paid for with gold, but that gold was bought with the nervous systems of Mexican laborers in the Santa Clara Hills. The ledger balances, but only if you ignore the biological depreciation. Today, we have digital gold, Bitcoin, which requires vast amounts of electricity. We criticize the energy consumption, but the analog gold of the 19th century required a consumable that was far more dangerous than a coal power plant. It required a substance that eats the brain, and for 50 years we poured it into the rivers of California as if it were water. The chemical reaction is simple: gold, mercury, amalgam. But the human reaction was complex: greed plus mercury, madness. The price of the flask was high, but the price of the vapor was absolute. Miners never expected the Quicksilver to cost more than the gold, but in the end, it cost them everything. The 3,000 tons yearly requirement wasn't just a supply chain statistic, it was a mortality quota, and the West met it year after year, until the gold was gone and only the poison remained. The ghost of the new Almaden mine sits quietly in the hills today, a county park where you can hike. But if you look at the ground, really look at it, you might see a tiny silver sphere trembling in the dust. It is waiting. It is the only thing in the park that will outlive the mountain itself.